Okay, everyone. Well, welcome to this week's Pulsus Research Seminar. As you'll know, we use the research seminars as a way to showcase cutting-edge research, sometimes from within the school and from our colleagues, but also very often from leading national and international scholars. And it's a great pleasure to have Terry MacDonald here. Terry's, I think, one of the kind of leading voices on ethics and IR in the country at the moment and making really important contributions to that debate. She's a senior lecturer at the University of Melbourne. She's the author of Global Stakeholder Democracy, OUP 2008, and an edited collection on global political justice that came out in 2013. She got her MPhil and DPhil from Oxford University, and she's held positions at Oxford and ANU and Monash before going to Melbourne, and she's currently an associate editor of the journal Global Governance. And Terry's going to talk to us on the question of global legitimacy, which is something that has occupied the minds of many people in this room, so I'm sure that this will provoke a good discussion. So over to you, Terry.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about this topic with all these people here. So just want to give you an overview of what I'm trying to do. So I'm writing a book about global political legitimacy at the moment. I'm trying to develop a new normative theory of global political legitimacy. And what I want to do today is to really give an overview of that project, of what I'm trying to do, of what I see the key problem as being, what I think is a helpful strategy of trying to tackle this problem. And then just give a sense of what I think some of the key claims are that I'm wanting to argue for. Obviously, in 40 minutes, I can't hope to unpack all of the actual details of the arguments that I'm offering or any of the institutional illustrations of what follows and so on. But I just want to give you a bit of a taster of some of the key claims that I'm trying to defend. So let me begin by talking a little bit about the problem of global political legitimacy. So legitimacy obviously is one of those words that gets used a lot in many different kinds of contexts, particularly in debates that are concerned with the evaluation of international institutions. People talk about legitimacy and legitimacy deficits, obviously in relation to states, the evaluation of states, questions of external state legitimacy, under what conditions are states entitled to non-intervention, diplomatic standing, various kinds of privileges associated with sovereignty. Obviously, these are very familiar cases. International organisations, obviously EU legitimacy, international financial institutions, the UN, NGOs, non-governmental organisations. There's been huge debates, obviously, in recent decades about the ways in which humanitarian organisations and development organisations exercising enormous amounts of power and wielding huge budgets, operating internationally, about how they legitimise their activities, both in terms of direct humanitarian assistance and development work and the influence that they wield in decision-making at higher-level international institutions, and also in the economic sectors, transnational corporations, and broader kinds of agencies, supply chain networks, international banks, and so on. Questions of legitimacy come up here too. And the what people are asking when they question their legitimacy is some version of under what conditions do these institutions warrant our support? What right do they have to exercise the forms of power that they do and expect our assent and compliance? So how do we go about trying to figure out how to determine under what conditions this very diverse range of international institutions can be judged as legitimate and therefore warrant the forms of support that they demand? Now, there are a number of obstacles to trying to answer this question, which is one of the reasons why I think that the theories of international legitimacy are as difficult, convoluted, controversial as they have been for some time and remain. The difficulties start with conceptual difficulties, because of course the concept of legitimacy is one that's used across a range of disciplines to do a whole lot of different, though related, forms of analytic work. And obviously one of the big distinctions that's commonly drawn is between moral and sociological concepts of legitimacy, whereby moral concepts of legitimacy are asking something to do with the moral right or the moral claim that institutions have to rule or exercise power or demand compliance or whatever it may be. And sociological conceptions of legitimacy, so the story goes, are concerned with analysing empirically the conditions on which institutions can attract the the forms of support or compliance that they demand. Now, the difficulty with this distinction is, although it looks like quite a clean distinction when it's set up on those terms, but there's this persistent nagging sense that people have that actually they're not separate concepts, that they're actually connected in some way, that when we make normative or evaluative judgments about the legitimacy of institutions, that is, the extent to which they deserve or warrant our support, it does actually matter in some way how motivated people actually are and what kinds of motivations they have under what conditions to support institutions. Some scholars tend to say, well, people are confused. People think this is a common thing that people do, but really they're just muddled, and that we really need to draw a clean distinction, and we need to keep these questions separate, and moral philosophers need to do very rigorous work about what people ought to do and what rights institutions have, and sociologists ought to do very rigorous empirical analysis over there, of what really motivates people to support institutions. One of the things that I want to say, and I think there are some other scholars who share this kind of intuition, is that that's actually a mistake to say that it's all just a muddle and a confusion, but to insist that there is actually a deep connection between these two sides of the analysis of legitimacy. And those of you in this room who've worked on legitimacy will be familiar with some of the work that's now coming out of realist traditions of political scholarship on legitimacy, Bernard Williams and others, Matt Sleet and some others have done some work around this, who've tried to make the argument that they are connected, that when we think about legitimacy, we do need to think about it as a standard of political acceptability of some kind. So it's a normative standard, but it does have something to do with acceptability, that the actual reasons that people have that can motivate support. The problem is how we can make sense of that has not really been developed. It's still a very elusive sort of notion. Some of these philosophers and these realists, they talk about political normativity, that in standard philosophical arguments, ethical theory, there's a distinction, obviously a familiar distinction, commonly made between moral normativity, moral oughts on the one hand, and strategic forms of instrumental rationality on the other hand. These are two different kinds of normativity. Act in a way that brings about your ends versus act in a way that complies with some moral rule that's justified. And a claim that's sometimes made is that there's a third kind of legitimacy, of normativity, a category of ought claims. It has its own structure of justification, a particular set of reasons that we can bring to bear in argumentation. In the same way that lawyers talk about a distinctive form of legal normativity, when we make claims about what is legal or illegal, we're making normative claims. We're making claims about what people ought to do, acting within some legal framework. But legal normativity is distinct from moral normativity. To say something is immoral is a different kind of claim than to say that it's illegal. It's a similar kind of distinction. It's this idea of political normativity that's sometimes invoked to say, when we say that something is legitimate, we're invoking a different structure of justification, a different family of reasons are being brought to bear in the argumentation. I think there's a lot in that, and I think what I'm trying to do here is to give an account of what that distinctive mode of justification is that's linked to this value of political legitimacy, that can account for one of the things that's useful, I think, to philosophers. There are other things that are useful to institutional designers. One of the things that's useful to philosophers is that it can account for this very elusive connection between the motivational, sociological, and the normative, justificatory dimensions of the idea of legitimacy. So that's the conceptual dimension of the challenge. Then there are also some substantive dimensions of the challenge. So obviously there's been a lot of substantive normative work has been done over many centuries on the idea of political legitimacy. There are a number of features of this work that that raise problems. They haven't been so problematic, or these problems have been able to sit in the background to some degree of normative theories of state legitimacy. But what I want to say is that they come to the fore and can't be evaded when we're trying to deal with questions about the legitimacy of institutions operating transnationally beyond the state. So a number of features of normative theories of political legitimacy, democratic theories, liberal theories in particular have been the dominant ones. Obviously, the main feature, the most important feature of these literatures is they're focused on the state, some of them explicitly so. Obviously, in some theoretical argument, the concept of legitimacy is defined in such a way, the concept of political legitimacy is defined in such a way that it's concerned with the state and justifying or giving some kind of normative support for the distinctive forms of power that are vested in states. Liberal and democratic theories have been dominant. There's a lot more agreement about the standards than their justifications. That's another feature of the normative theory of political legitimacy as it's developed. A lot of this theory, there's not a huge amount of disagreement, obviously there has been some, but certainly mainstream political theory now, most of the argument really centres on how we justify liberal institutions or how we justify democratic institutions. There's not a wide range of alternative standards that are really being given a lot of airtime in those debates. And, a lot of the ambiguities and the difficulties that go on in that justificatory argument is able to persist because at the end of the day, we're really only arguing about small differences when it comes to actual institutional standards. Another feature worth flagging of established theoretical substantive arguments about legitimacy is that underpinning a lot of them, there's some kind of distinction that's acknowledged between sometimes it's talked about as input versus output legitimacy. This is a term, obviously, that's been introduced in the context of arguments about EU legitimacy. Sometimes in liberal debates you see this, a version of this distinction sometimes comes up framed as legitimacy versus justification of state institutions, for example. It's roughly tracking this sort of input-output kind of idea, whereby on the one hand we evaluate institutions based on what they do, what kinds of functions they perform, what kinds of benefits they generate for their citizens or constituencies. On the other hand, on the input side, we evaluate institutions based on some kind of procedural or other institutional relations in which they stand to their constituencies, how they're defined. So that distinction's there, but it's murky, and it's not really clear how those two dimensions of legitimacy actually relate to one another. If it turns out that they come into tension with one another, how do we decide what weight to accord? That's actually not something that's really been dealt with very systematically, and one of the things I want to talk about is why and how we get past that. And finally, another difficulty that these theories have run into, particularly in recent years, when theories of legitimacy, democratic legitimacy and so on have begun to be applied to global levels, is a tension between idealism and realism. To what degree, when we develop theories, normative theories of institutional legitimacy, are we trying to develop some kind of ideal, whether it's a democratic ideal, whether it's a moral ideal connected to some notion of justice, against which we're evaluating institutions, recognising that they might fall short, but nonetheless giving ourselves a standard of legitimacy which fits with our highest values and our highest moral conceptions. And to what extent are we trying to come up with standards which are more fully adjusted to some of the more uncomfortable realities of the way states and other institutions function, so more realist notions of legitimacy that might recognise we don't and probably will never achieve full justice and need to set standards of institutions which recognise that. So there's a tension between idealist and realist elements in the theory of legitimacy, which reflects, I think, this position that it has between, on the one hand, moral theories and what it is that moral theorists do when they develop theories of justice, institutional ideals, and on the other hand, sociological empirical scholars who want to analyse evaluative standards based on an understanding of how they actually function and develop support in practice. So there's some of the tensions. As I said, although those tensions are not new and those puzzles are not new, they've bubbled along, for centuries. They haven't disrupted too much the broad liberal and democratic consensus. At the end of the day, we can all continue talking about this topic on relatively reasonably common terms because at the end of the day, we all agree on more or less on what a legitimate institution looks like, or at least some important features of it, the level of the state, and that's that liberal democratic consensus. Now, the problem when we get to the level of global politics is that some of these tensions create huge problems. What they do is they create a huge gap between the kinds of ideas about legitimacy that are generated in theory and the kinds of intuitions about what are appropriate standards to judge institutional acceptability or support-worthiness at the level of international institutions. So just to run quickly through, states obviously are a less dominant form of institution. All these other kinds of institutions that I mentioned at the start are subject to legitimacy assessments, but it's not always clear. In fact, it's hugely contested, the idea that liberal and democratic standards, which are used to judge the legitimacy of states, are appropriate for thinking about the legitimacy of an NGO or a corporation or an international bank. Human rights standards at an international level are very commonly accorded a very great significance. People think that compliance with human rights standards, if you talk about corporations, taking on some responsibility for human rights protection, these sorts of things are often accorded greater weight in evaluating the legitimacy of institutions internationally than are some of the traditional forms of constitutional structure and democratic control and so on that operate at the level of states. The reasons for that are unclear. And because of this gap, the sort of the working intuitive standards that are very commonly invoked, ideas of accountability and transparency and so on, there's some loose connection to democratic traditions and to liberal traditions, but it's only a very loose connection because the sort of more detailed, fine-grained justifications which have been developed at the level of the state don't transfer, as we're dropping certain elements of those institutions out, and it's not really clear why we demand some but not others. And so standards of legitimacy tend to be produced in a fairly ad hoc, intuitive way, which makes them, some of the work that Buchanan and Cohane have done recently on this topic, come up with some very plausible sounding criteria, complex standards and so on. A lot of what they say, many liberals at least, many liberal internationals would agree that these are some reasonable standards. The problem is there's a huge justificatory gap there. It's not really clear why these standards, and to those who might think that those standards are too demanding or not demanding enough, it's not really clear what reasons can be brought to bear to argue one way or the other. You accept them or you don't. So what do we do? What do we do about this problem? So the first thing I want to say, I just want to say a little bit about the strategy, the kind of analytic strategy. And I know not everyone here, in fact probably most of you are not normative theorists, so it's not only in the study of legitimacy, but in the study of normative questions in general. I think sometimes empirical scholars are sometimes mystified by the notion that you can develop arguments that are more than just expressions of opinion on these sorts of matters. So I just want to say a little bit about what I think is a useful strategy of trying to make a contribution, a theoretical contribution that can improve our understanding of these matters. So the first thing I want to say is obviously one thing that some political philosophers, particularly those with a grounding in moral philosophy, try to do is to say, well, there are correct answers. We can figure them out through the right kind of philosophical reflection, and this is what rights people have, and this is what understanding of legitimacy follows, and so on. So that's a very familiar strategy. That's not the strategy that I'm inclined to follow, because I don't really believe that there's a truth of the matter, for some of the reasons that I think others in this room would probably agree with. So the strategy that I adopt to normative theory in general is more of an interpretive one. So the idea here is that values like legitimacy, they have a particular currency in a particular political community. The reason that I'm motivated to write about legitimacy is because it's a value that's commonly invoked to support and lend weight to claims. And these kinds of concepts provide organising frameworks as well, around which actors that are members of political communities can forge agreements and forms of consensus on which they can hang institutions that everyone will be motivated to support. So the starting point is the idea that the fact that everyone is talking about legitimacy and they're using this idea to structure certain kinds of political arguments and claims and to design institutions reflects the fact that although we might not be very clear in theoretical terms, there's at least enough broad intuitive agreement there, at least among enough people, that we can try to make more coherent sense of that. And for the way that I see this project and see normative theory, normative political theory in general, the aim of a normative political theory is to try to render more coherent and therefore stronger and more useful some of the normative concepts that we use to coordinate our behaviour and design and seek support for our institutions. So the method there is an interpretive method. The idea is that we try to give a reading, I suppose, an interpretive reading of this idea, the way that it's used, the values that it embodies. So that's the underlying idea. The value of theorising about legitimacy on this account is there's an explanatory payoff and a prescriptive payoff. The explanatory payoff is, as I said a minute ago, there are a number of widely held intuitions about the importance of human rights, about the fact that democratic standards will sometimes be required, but not for all institutions as standards of legitimacy, about the need for contextual variability in general of standards that are applied to different kinds of institutions. There are some quite secure intuitions that people have. We don't have a systematic framework that can account for them and that can account for them in a cohesive way. And so the explanatory goal of this kind of theory is to provide that systematic framework, and the value of that is that when we have that systematic framework, it makes our values stronger. You know, if we can offer justifications for them which are robust and coherent, it becomes easier to attract the kind of support for them, which can then translate into greater support for valuable institutions. So that's the first payoff is that explanatory strengthening role that the theories can play with respect to these values. The second part of it, though, is there are some areas, although, as I said, there are some issues on which there is quite wide consensus. There are also areas of quite a lot of controversy. And once we have a good theory of a value, whether it's justice or legitimacy or rights or something else, that theory can then be brought to bear to help adjudicate and resolve hard cases as well, these controversies. So there are those two kinds of payoff. And when I get to the sort of last 15 minutes or so of the talk, when I've talked a bit about how I want to theorise legitimacy, one of the things I want to do is to say what I think the payoffs are of this theoretical model in terms of how it can do this explanatory work of making sense of this settled set of intuitions that many people have about international legitimacy, how it differs from state-level legitimacy, and secondly, how we can use it to advocate some a little more controversial sorts of claims about global institutional design and what institutions do and don't warrant support and what conditions. So that's a little something about the strategy. Having said that, although the strategy is interpretive, that doesn't mean that I'm not going to don't use sort of standard analytic techniques of conceptual analysis and critical engagement with established liberal and democratic theories and so on along the way, because I take it that that's a good way of situating the new account in relation to the familiar, but also building on the elements of established traditions that still do inform and help to make sense of the ideas about legitimacy which have strong currency at the global level. Okay, so that's just a bit of setup really, to say what the problem is and what the strategy is. How I think we can try to tackle this problem in a way that's useful and meaningful. Now, obviously the big part of the project is the actual idea. What is legitimacy? What kinds of reasons do we bring to bear in making arguments about legitimacy, and what kinds of standards do we want to apply in the global domain? Now, I try very briefly to run you through what's quite a dense set of arguments here. I'll do my best. I'm assuming that there'll be questions and things I need to unpack more at the end, but here goes. So the central idea that I'm trying to develop is at a conceptual level first, that legitimacy is a value that's concerned with helping institutions to support collective action. So there's a connection here between the idea, a conceptual connection, between the idea of legitimacy and the idea of collective action. And this simple idea, and this is based on a very simple intuitive idea. In looking for standards of acceptability for institutions, we should be guided by an understanding of what institutions in general are for and what institutions are, the nature of an institution, what it is that institutions do, is they provide frameworks of rules that help groups identify and pursue shared values. That's the function of institutions. So a good institution, a support-worthy institution, is one that performs that function of an institution well. Right? So that's a sort of simple, Aristotelian kind of pseudo-Aristotelian logic of thinking about how we come up with an evaluative standard for a thing. We ask what is the function of that thing, and then we come up with a standard that tells us how to help that thing perform its function well. So that's the very simple intuitive idea. I think this intuitive idea that legitimacy is a value connected to helping institutions support collective action is one that can help make sense as well of democratic and liberal ideas of legitimacy. Democratic theories of legitimacy give a particular kind of account of collective action, which is, as I'll talk about a bit more in a minute, very much focused on collective decision making and how to facilitate that. Liberal theories of collective action are based on a particular idea of autonomous collective justification, which is also an agency-based model. So I won't go into all the sort of philosophical arguments about the nature of action, collective action. It's not time, but I think there's intuitive appeal for a conceptual model. A conceptual account of legitimacy as a value that's concerned with supporting collective action. For those of you who sort of more interested in the technical debates around legitimacy, I think something like this resonates extremely strongly, very deeply in fact, with some of that piece that, again, I've referred to it before, that Buchanan and Cohane wrote in Ethics and International Affairs on international institutional legitimacy, which explicitly characterises the problem of legitimacy as concerned with solving collective action problems, and there's a lot to say about that account. It's not time to go into it today, but I think it's that same basic intuition which I'm trying to capture here. Okay, now the problem with that is it doesn't really tell us that much. Collective action's a very abstract idea. The concept of legitimacy is arguably as broad as it is and as controversial as it is because it parallels the ways in which the concept of agency and collective agency are also extremely broad and cut across sociological as well as normative literatures as well. So that kind of conceptual framing needs to go further. We actually need to have a substantive account of what collective action is that has normative content. And this is where all the meat of the argument comes in. So it's not time to go into the detail, but what I want to do today is just give you a very brief typology of three different types of ways of thinking about what collective action is: a democratic one, a liberal one, and the one that I want to defend, the new one, which is call it practice-based or pragmatic. I'm not sure what label yet I want to use, but it's some version of that, which draws on a particular view of agency, which is more practice-based than the liberal or democratic alternatives. So democratic theories of legitimacy tend to focus on, particularly in the deliberative forms that have been most influential in the last couple of decades, characterise legitimacy as a particular form of collective decision-making, which is communicative, which involves free communication, or which respects political equality, or there are different conditions that attach to that. But what all these democratic versions, accounts of political legitimacy share in common is that they're all trying to give an account of what is a good collective decision-making procedure. The idea there is when we identify the right kind of collective decision-making procedure through which members of a community can decide how they want to act, then we know what the requirements are for a legitimate institution. So for Democrats, to identify what they are, whether it's a participatory model, whether it's a representative model, whether it's some hybrid model. Legitimacy comes from collective decision-making institutions. Now, the problem with this kind of model is that it's developed alongside, and I would say it piggybacks on, sovereign state structures in ways that are not always recognised in democratic theories. So although Democrats talk about legitimacy as though it's constituted by these collective decision-making procedures, in fact, and they'll acknowledge that obviously it's not enough just to make decisions, they then have to be carried out. But this question of, well, who carries them out and how are the institutional capabilities and the material capabilities that are necessary for them to be carried out, how are they constituted and how are they sustained? Democrats don't really talk about that on the whole. And the reason they haven't had to talk about that on the whole is that their theories of legitimacy have been developed to be applied to states. And the problem of, what material governance capacity is like and how it's generated, we've already got that. We've got states that have all this material power and this monopoly of force in their territory and so on. So states already have the capacity, and the challenge for the theory of legitimacy in the democratic tradition has been to show how they warrant the forms of power that they wield. The problem when you try to apply that kind of theory of legitimacy to the global domain is that we don't have a state structure that's set up. In fact, we have, obviously, that there are some forms of power which are exercised and problematic for liberals and others, but there's also great problems of a lack of institutional capability. And this is one of the things, obviously, that comes between members of the global community being able to just go and enact their decisions, is we actually don't have effective institutional frameworks with the material capabilities to do that. And so there's this gap, I think, in democratic theories of legitimacy on the material capacity side. This comes back to this question of this relationship between input-output legitimacy. The output dimension kind of drops out of the picture within democratic theory. And you can see how this feeds some of the tensions, some of the intuitive clashes between some of the global democratisation agendas on the one hand, and what it is that real activists would actually want to advocate on the other hand. So if you think, for example, this is something I've done some work on in the past, how you might assess the legitimacy of an NGO, a development humanitarian NGO. Now, many of the democratically inspired agendas for greater legitimacy focus on things like accountability and, including stakeholders in, more deliberation and more accountability and so on. And this takes you a certain way. But one of the problems you run up against in pushing those kinds of agendas through to their logical democratic conclusions is that at a certain point, demanding more inclusion, demanding more accountability, requires certain kinds of changes to the organisational structure of these institutions that actually undermines their motivating functions. You can only demand so many accountability reports back to donors and states and local communities and so on before all the resources of the institution are sucked dry. They've actually got no capability left, or they become such huge bureaucratic creatures that they're, the institutional agility and so on that gave them some of the operational advantages on the ground begins to be lost. So there are direct trade-offs there. And democratic theory doesn't really give us any tools for figuring out how we make those trade-offs between the operational demands, the functional efficacy, the capability of an institution to do good, versus the demands for more inclusion, accountability and so on that Democrats want. So that's one way you can see where this gap in democratic theory plays out. The problems become even greater if you start trying to think about how you democratise a corporation, which is structured, again, with a very different kind of set of functions. So that's democratic theory. That's the first of the three ways of thinking about what collective action is, collective decision making. And what I'm wanting to say is when we apply that to the global level, we see that it's missing something. What it's missing is an account of material governance capability and how that connects to the decision making side. Liberal theories are more complicated. It's going to be harder to do justice to them in 2 minutes, but the basic claim that I want to make about liberal theories of legitimacy, liberal theories of collective action, which feed liberal theories of legitimacy, do a little bit better about making space for institutions to develop in ways that are driven by their functional demands. And this is where, obviously, liberal theories of public versus private are absolutely essential, I think. One of the key things that liberal political theory wants to do is to carve out this space, this private sphere, in which a lot of the motivations that actors have, a lot of the capacities that they have to spontaneously organise and coordinate and so on, that we leave room for that, because the liberal tradition does recognise that you don't identify all that's good and you don't identify the best ways to produce what's good just through sitting around deliberating, like deliberative Democrats sometimes seem to imply. The liberal tradition certainly recognises that you need to create space, you need to support less deliberative, I suppose, forms of coordination and collective action to take place in the private sphere. But that's always obviously accompanied by what goes on in the liberal theory of the public sphere, the liberal theory of state legitimacy, which demands rationalisation based on a particular ideal an ideal of agency which is connected to a value of individual autonomy. And so the private sphere for liberals is always needing to be curtailed and regulated and overseen by this state institution, which is justified, and obviously is hugely elaborate theories of this, but to simplify massively, which is justified in a way that reflects very idealised forms of rationality and of strategic and moral rationality, you can say. So liberal theories of public justification, I think, are very elaborate contemporary articulations of what an ideally rationalised public institutional sphere entails. So the problem with that is that liberal theory has taken us to a place where their standards of legitimacy that are advocated by liberals are so idealised. It's not even quite clear within liberal theory. They either revert back to a democratic deliberation, as in sort of, Rawlsian political liberalism, Habermasian styles of liberalism, or they revert back to a comprehensive liberalism expressed in a theory of justice. And you end up with this realism-idealism gap. The kinds of forms of legitimate institution that international liberals now advocate, these hugely morally idealised institutional forms that have such a remote resemblance to anything that's actually emerging or looks like it could be feasible in our lifetimes or perhaps the next generation's lifetimes, that it's not clear how these, even as ideal models, it's not really clear what prescriptive implications they have, because the kinds of choices we're making about institutional design is unrecognisable. The kinds of prescriptions that have been made in these ideal cosmopolitan models or internationalist models that liberals come up with are unrecognisable. So you get that ideal realist gap in liberal theories. So the alternative then that I want to develop is a normative theory of legitimacy, which is, instead of being based on this democratic collective decision-making, deliberative model of collective action, or on this liberal, rational, reasonable justification model of legitimacy, draws on an understanding of what collective agency is, of what social agency is in general, and what collective agency can mean in light of that, which is inspired by pragmatist or practice-based traditions of social theory and normative theory more broadly. So the label that I'm attaching to it's a collective political empowerment idea. Rather than talking about democracy, I'm wanting to talk about collective political empowerment. And the idea is that very much like liberals want to protect a sphere for organisations to develop more organically, based on a set of motivations other than those that can be articulated and justified in public deliberation. I'm thinking about the idea, and again, I'm not sure about all the labels, so tell me if these are intuitive or not, but I'm wanting to talk about a broader set of value tracking capacities. So the idea here is that whereas liberals think about agency as being constituted through the exercise of certain forms of rationality, which are quite narrowly understood often. Pragmatic traditions, and when I say practice-based traditions here, I'm thinking also of conservative theory, some realist theory, as well as classical American pragmatists, Dewey and Mead, and so on, who obviously have theories of social action agency that recognise the important role of the ways in which values can be revealed in and reflected in and discovered through activity, embodied activity, not just through rational reflection or communication in dialogue. And there's a massive amount of social theory I can draw. Don't have time to go into any of it, but I think the idea is intuitive enough. And it's an idea that obviously conservative political theorists like Burke and others and tried to develop in some of their justifications for institutions which were opposed to strong forms of rationalism. There are some kinds of values that can't be fully rationalised. I think there's a whole set of practice-based theories that help us to track and to capture what those value tracking capacities are. So the idea is once we give an account of those, drawing on drawing on this social theory practice. And then out of that, what we get is we get a theory of collective action. We get a model of collective action, of political collective action, which is not quite liberal and not quite democratic. What it requires there's a strong principle of non-domination. So you need, obviously, in order to protect a sphere, whereas liberals want to protect a private sphere that protects individual autonomy, what this version of the collective action ideal tries to do is to protect a more broadly conceived sphere of non-domination, whereby not only autonomous capabilities, but a whole range of ways in which people identify and pursue value, which can include emotional forms of solidarity that can't necessarily be fully rationalised, forms of experimentation, and so on, in which they can flourish. These need to be constrained in situations where there's a lot of political contestation and conflict. They need to be constrained by deliberative structures, certainly, but whereas deliberative democratic theories of legitimacy leave out this material side of agency, the ways in which values can be expressed, the ways in which collectives can coordinate their activity and pursue shared values that's my timer telling me that I should be done. Okay, can I just take 2 more minutes?
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Just quick. Okay, so that's the idea. That's the basic idea. This leaves me with 2 minutes to talk about the institutional payoffs. So give me 1 minute for the explanatory payoff and 1 for the prescriptive payoff. Okay, so once you've done all this theoretical work, the explanatory payoff, I think, is this helps us capture some of those intuitive ideas that I talked about before. First of all, the role of human rights. We can develop an understanding of human rights as a framework that lays out some of the conditions for this understanding of non-domination. So human rights sets out a certain set of protections that need to be in place in order for us to be confident that the forms of political organisation and association that develop reflect the values that communities have and the sorts of projects that they have good reason to support as expressed in their institutions. It can better explain when and why democracy is a condition for legitimacy by bringing back in this output dimension, by creating more space for the forms of associational interaction that drive the development of non-state forms of institution in the first place, NGOs, corporations, different kinds of structures in the global economy and so on. We can see why it is that not all institutions need to be democratic in order to be legitimate, but that sometimes, in order to preserve their valuable functions, lesser forms of public control and accountability and so on might be warranted. And it can also account for wide variability in standards because the functions of institutions of different types are so varied, the operational demands of those institutions will be similarly varied and the standards that are required to protect those will be varied. Prescriptive payoffs, I don't really have a lot of time for, but let me just one really important one that I do want to mention is that there's one of the more controversial ones maybe is a rejection of any kind of strong public-private divide. So the idea that state institutions or the international organisations that are developed by states have some very special status that's in some way independent of their actual functions is rejected. So, I think often states, in virtue of being states, are accorded some kind of special role or protection or worthiness of support. I want to reject that and say many states are captured by and advance the interests of elites just like, other institutional types, and that we should actually take account of that when we make judgments about the legitimacy of those states, but also of the institutions that they interact with. There are some implications for the way we evaluate institutions operating in development contexts, for example, where now a problem that many development practitioners are beginning to note is that there's a lot of emphasis on particular kinds of standards. You need more accountability, you need more transparency, you need more this and that. Often to the point where they become dysfunctional, to the point where they begin to interfere with some of the justifying purposes. So again, this gives us a framework of trying to push back against some of those kinds of more dysfunctional consequences of some of these democratisation agendas and so on. I'll leave it there. There's a lot more to say. I've already gone over time.
Fantastic. Great, that's wonderful. Thanks, Terry.